Hi Vikings, I'm Terry,
And I'm Susan. Welcome to Vik Equip.
where we are equipping you, our students, to be successful in the classroom.
Sometimes when we're writing, we'll want to quote another individual. How do we use those quotation marks? Let's take a look at a few ways to use quotation marks. The first way that we can use a quotation mark is inside a direct quote. All right, so I want to take someone else's exact words and use them, but if I don't put quotation marks around them, it looks like they're my words, and that can cause a problem for our reader. So I'm going to take those exact words and I'm going to put them inside quotation marks. Now there's a certain way that we do that in sentences. We always want to separate non-quoted words from quoted words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma. So you can see in this first sentence, Ernest always told me it's better to give than to receive. Ernest always told me, those are my words, they're not quoted words. So I'm going to separate those words from his words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma. Once the quotation begins, I want to try to keep all punctuation inside those quotation marks. Have you ever wrestled with that question of whether to move the punctuation outside or keep it inside? 99% of the time, it stays inside. I'll show you an exception in just a few minutes. You can see in the next sentence, she asked, those are my words, separate my words from her words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma, and then begin the quote, is the water cold? You'll notice that again the punctuation stays inside, but this time I can use a question mark because she's asking a question. In the next set of examples, you can see that the quote starts the sentence and then we identify the speaker. But the rules don't change. Once a quote begins, keep all punctuation inside. But I still have to separate quoted words from non-quoted words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma. You'll also see that I can separate quoted words from non-quoted words with a question mark. The question mark indicates that Ramon is asking this question, right? I can do that. I can separate it. I can also separate quoted words from non-quoted words with an exclamation mark. I just cannot separate quoted words from non-quoted words with a period. When I put a period, the sentence is done. But I can use other forms of punctuation. Okay, in the next example, you can see that we've identified the speaker in the middle of the sentence. So again, all the rules apply. Once the quote begins, keep all punctuation inside those quotation marks. Separate quoted words from non-quoted words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma. You can see the same thing happens here, where I'm separating non-quoted words from quoted words with that punctuation, that comma. And then my ending punctuation is kept inside the quotation marks, 99% of the time. In the next sentence, I just wanted you to be able to see that if the quoted words involves more than one sentence, now I can put a period. My mother warned me, comma, save your money, you might need it for a rainy day. Ending punctuation, close quotation. Here the period is okay because my mother is saying more than one sentence worth of words. Now, I say that you separate quoted words from non-quoted words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma, and that's true if the quote is a full sentence. However, if the quote is just a few words, then we don't need that comma to introduce the quotation. For instance, he liked the idea of the company going to the top. You can see that that's not a full sentence. It's just a phrase. So I do not need a comma to separate my quoted from my non-quoted words. According to President Faulkner, CASE is growing and thriving. So I've just chosen a few of his words to plop down in my sentence. It's not a complete sentence. No comma is needed. When can that punctuation move outside of the quotation marks? Well, an example like this. Do you agree with the saying, all's fair in love and war? The saying is all's fair in love and war. It's a statement. I'm asking the question. So the question mark moves outside of the punctuation to show that I, the original speaker, I am asking the question, not the quote itself. So there are a few instances like that where your punctuation can move outside of the quotation marks. You also want to keep in mind that you won't use quotation marks with what we call an indirect quote. If I'm quoting your exact words, that's a direct quote. It needs quotation marks. But if I'm just paraphrasing what you've said and I'm not using your exact words, that's considered an indirect quote. You can see the example here. Tom predicted it will be a close game. Those are Tom's exact words, so I have to put those inside quotation marks. And you can see the comma separating the non-quoted from the quoted. However, I just say Tom predicted that it would be a close game. I can't put those in quotation marks anymore because that it would be a close game, those are not Tom's exact words. Right? So that's just conveying his ideas, and it's considered an indirect quote. A second way that we use quotation marks is to show whether we're reading an article or a shorter work or a larger work. For instance, have you ever written the title of a book and wondered, like, how do I signify that this is a title? We used to underline it back in the old days, but all of that underlining has been taken away. And now we rely on quotation marks or italics. So when you're using a title, you have to ask yourself, is this a shorter work or a longer work? For instance, is it a chapter? I stop and I ask myself, was a chapter a part of a larger work? Indeed it is. It's a part of a book. So the book is the longer work, it gets italics. The chapter is the shorter work. I place that inside quotation marks. You can see the same thing happening here. Usually a poem isn't published by itself. It's usually a part of an anthology. It's usually in a book. And so the poem title would be in quotation marks as a shorter work, while the book itself would be italicized. A song is considered a short work. It's a part of an album or a CD. An article is a short work. It's a part of a magazine or a newspaper. So we always put article titles inside quotation marks, but we will italicize magazine and newspapers. I think about a play. A play is usually an hour and a half, 2 hours long, right? But it can be divided into smaller parts. We call those scenes or acts. Those would be in quotation marks, while the play and movie titles themselves would be in italics. An episode, Barney Got a Gun, right, from the Andy Griffith Show. So the episode title would be in quotation marks, and then the TV show itself would be in italics. When you're using those in a sentence, you can see that it follows all the same rules that we've already discussed, except we don't need to separate the quoted from the non-quoted with a comma, because we're not using a direct quote in its entirety. So it would look something like this in a sentence. Do you like Poe's The Raven? Right, again, The Raven is a poem. It's a short work. It's in quotation marks. I'm going to move that question mark outside of the quotation marks because I'm asking the question. It's not entitled The Raven, so I'm asking the question mark comes outside. You could then reply, I did enjoy The Raven. Now you notice that the punctuation moves back inside. Again, that's where it stays 99% of the time. The third way we can use quotation marks is to show like a special emphasis. This rule has changed over the years. In the past, when we wanted to show special emphasis for a word, we might put quotation marks around it. My teacher doesn't realize that groovy is no longer a cool term. So we might put quotation marks, just like we would air quotation marks. However, we're being asked not to do that anymore. In fact, you really don't want to emphasize words at all. But if you do, instead of using quotation marks, use italics instead. You could listen to the experts, or you could do what is right. So we're going to put that in and we're going to italicize it rather than put it inside quotation marks. Now this is kind of fun. Have you ever seen like double quotation marks and then single quotation marks? When do you use those single quotation marks? You use single quotation marks when a double quotation mark is already in play. Right? Look at this example. Mary stated, I laughed so hard. So we can see it's a full sentence. I'm separating non-quoted words from quoted words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma. That quote has begun. But look, she says, I laughed so hard when he said, now Mary's quoting someone. The double quotation mark is already in play. So I have to revert to a single quotation mark, and all the rules still apply. I'm going to close out punctuations inside, close out the single quote, close out the double quote, so that everything comes to a complete end. Mary stated, my favorite poem is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Why is The Road Not Taken in single quotation marks? It's a title of a short work, so it has to be inside quotation marks. The double quotation marks are already in play, meaning I have to revert to a single quotation mark. So they're not quite as tricky as you might think. Let's practice just a few. I like to drink milk with cold pizza, Bentley shared. How would you fix this? Because that's a direct quote, I need to put his words in quotation marks, and I need to separate his words from my words with some kind of punctuation, usually a comma, and I'm going to keep that punctuation inside. The students enthusiastically chanted, "We're number one." Of course, "We're number one" is a direct quote. So follow all those same rules. Separate it with punctuation, begin your quotation mark, and then keep punctuation inside. Did you read the article Mile High in Time magazine last week? We have a lot going on here. Mile High is an article title. I'm going to put that inside quotation marks. Time is a larger work, so I'm going to put that in italics. Hopefully now you understand a little bit more about quotation marks and how we use them. Until next time, Vikings, sail on!